You're watching the New Stack Makers, a podcast for people who develop, deploy, and manage at-scale software. For more information and articles about at-scale technologies, please visit thenewstack.io. Now enjoy the show.
Hello world, Chris Perillo here for the New Stack, sitting inside a wonderful booth downtown Seattle for the Open Source Summit with John Kjell from TestifySec. I wanted to learn a little bit more about what had hit the news recently, something rather nefarious. But before we unpack that, let's learn a bit more about you. We just met a few minutes ago, but you know your background better than I do. John?
Yeah, thanks for having me here. So I am the director of open source at TestifySec. We're a company primarily focused on software supply chain security. Before working at TestifySec, I worked at VMware and Pivotal before that. And one of the teams I worked on there was the software distribution platform. It was the Pivotal network, the place all of our customers would go to get software. And as I learned how different development teams would collect and aggregate the things they were building, I started getting worried about how do we know what we're getting is coming from the right people and going into the right product. And so that was before SolarWinds. That was a few years ago, and over time it's evolved and the space has really blown up. And so it's been really exciting to see all the different developments and technology that are coming along to help solve the problem.
So would you consider yourself somewhat of a prognosticator then? If you saw on the horizon, I mean, it is realistic when you're talking about software that has dependencies and you don't know what those dependencies might be and who's maintaining those dependencies. I can only imagine it was top of mind for a lot of people, but you called it.
Yeah, I think that security in general has always been a problem since the very beginning. A lot of people always go back to the Thompson paper, Reflections on Trusting Trust, right? And he wrote that paper when he accepted the Turing Award in the late 70s. And he built a version of a compiler that built a backdoor into it. And every time that compiler was recompiled, that backdoor was always there. So not only did it reproduce itself, it was there forever.
In many ways, everything old is new again.
Yes.
which is really sad. And we'll unpack it, but could you give a higher level overview of what happened?
Yeah, so the XZ Utils library was compromised by a maintainer of the project. And so they put some malicious code into the release, and then that release started being consumed by upstream distributions. And I don't remember off it but think of Red Hat or SUSE or Debian, Arch Linux,
but the beta,
those sorts of things.
The betas.
They were all in unstable versions. It was the very beginning of getting pulled in. And this library is used with OpenSSH. And so part of the code inside of it allowed backdoor to be inserted so that whenever someone would do an SSH connection, they could basically get in. They could either remotely execute code on that server or they could directly log into that server.
So could you give us a sense of a timeline of how this really played out? Because from everything that I could tell, not being an expert like you are, specifically with supply chain management.
Security, yeah.
Oh, I was so close. It sounded like this was the seeds were planted years before it actually took place. Yeah.
And it was a couple of years ago when this person, they had a GitHub handle, and they started just showing up and contributing to different open source projects. And one of the projects they contributed to was XZ Utils. And this was back in, I think 2021, 2022. So more than a couple of years ago. And over time, they built up more trust. They, did more commits. Then, the social engineering aspects started kind of cropping up here of the primary maintainer, Lassie of XZ Utils, was this isn't most people's day job. They don't get paid to do this, and doing it on the side, trying to handle, and you get badgered by these large upstream, distros, companies selling these things to have more releases, to fix problems. And so other accounts started badgering the sole maintainer of this project, saying, you need to do more, you need to do it faster, you need to address all these concerns. And then this person walks in and says, I'm happy to help. And they had built up enough credibility beforehand to be introduced, and over time that led to being able to handle sensitive bug reports, being able to create their own releases, and that was how we ended up in the situation where we had the backdoor put in.
That's, it's interesting. You framed it, I feel pretty well. This isn't someone's day job necessarily to maintain the code. And it seems to me that's a wide swath of the open source community and in many ways the ethos. But so much of the industry, so much of our lives, the world is living and working through open source code in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, it's incredible, just as an ideal, that people would give away all of this code for free. And they would do it, as a bunch of nerds and technologists, a lot of times just to prove other people wrong, that I'll give you feedback, I'll write code because I can do it better. And a little bit of hubris, but there's also the goodwill, I think, of just wanting to be able to help everyone.
And I think that, to me, it was probably the most jarring, because you would assume good intent from anybody who was going to maintain a project. Is this relatively new in the sense that would it be a package?
Yeah, so it was just the source code. The release was just source code.
Okay, so weaponized. I mean, effectively the code was weaponized, and in such a way that if it wasn't discovered, I believe, on accident by someone who works at Microsoft, it would have slipped through and gone into what would you like the main distributions, not the betas. Has open source code been weaponized like this before?
I think it has. There's been a few different times in which people have attacked open source projects, but it's really I think a progression in the security threats. Previously there were enough security vulnerabilities just in the code itself. You didn't have to do any extra work, right? You had 0 days all over the place.
Right.
But now, as there's more adoption of open source, this XZ Utils is used all over the place. It's in almost every Linux distribution. So getting your foot in the door to that has such a wide and broad impact, which is why catching it before it actually happened is so important that happened.
Did that make your job and the jobs of your colleagues, specifically your role, that much more difficult, or more like vindication? This is it.
Yeah, I think it's a little of both. The having to deal with the fallout would have been much worse, of after the fact. At the same time, it raises the question of what's going on today that we don't know about, right? These accounts were created 2 years ago. Who else has created accounts over the last 2 years? Was this even the first one? There's definitely this evolution over time and this persistent nature of the threat.
So in terms of magnitude, how critical is XZ Utils?
So
what does it do and its function? And
so it's a compression library.
Okay.
And that's the thing, that compression is everywhere. when you do requests from the internet, when you send and receive transmissions over the network, and in this case it was included in OpenSSH. And I think there were specific things in this backdoor that was looking for the way OpenSSH was using the different cryptographic libraries so that it could get in there and kind of interject itself. And so it was pretty specific and targeted to that, but people use OpenSSH all over the place. And just because they targeted this particular library and executable, it could have just as easily been anything else. So
now I've seen, of course, this being covered ad infinitum, and I've been tracking it, not being a developer, not being someone who knows anything. Your last name's Shell, correct?
Yeah.
Is that like ZH or ZSH? Is that a shell? SH is a shell?
Yes, yeah.
But not spelled like that. Sorry.
So-
I'm probably not the first person to say that. But you got to admit, you were kind of born into this role.
Yeah, in my undergrad operating systems class, we had to write our own shell. And of course, I named it KJELL as my shell. So
That's great. In the wake of all this, how have your colleagues, how have other professionals really responded and reacted? I assume measured, but also like what has been their reaction?
yeah, it's been really varied. We've seen consumers have a knee-jerk reaction that we shouldn't consume open source. And so there's been a lot of support of the community from everywhere, really, to say, no, this problem was prevented and seen because it was open source, because you could analyze the code, you could track back the commits and understand who was doing what and why they were doing it. And so that was like one aspect of it. And then I've never seen so many references to ambulance chasers on LinkedIn as I did almost immediately after the exploit was discovered. And there were a lot of people who wanted to have an immediate reaction to it, to say our tool could prevent this or the other tools could prevent this. And there was a change to program Google runs called OSS Fuzz that constantly scans a ton of really important open source projects. And there were some people critical of that, saying you allowed this compromise, this change meant that it was undetectable. But in reality, it's more complicated than that, right? It's like when we started having to take our shoes off at the airport. It was a specific response to one specific threat, but the broader theme is still there, that if someone is able to earn this privilege to be a maintainer, to be a committer, to create releases, then they can do more or less whatever they want to, especially over time.
And to, I guess, put a better framework around it, taking off your shoes at the airport may be security theater. This is more real security, like absolute security. Not to get into that too deeply, but when most of these projects are maintained by individuals from a passion about their background, their interest. How, if at all, and your thoughts specifically, how could something like this be mitigated in the future? I mean, you've got the scanning tools that might happen after the fact, but there's no effective way to build gravitas, right? Apart from social engineering their way through something. I mean, what could be done?
Yeah, so I think this is a conversation we have a lot in terms of this balance between the amount of time and energy the open source maintainers have with what the solution really could be, because it's going to be more work. And this is where I think the organizations that consume open source and profit from it really could invest their time and energy to support this. And the things that I would recommend doing is having more transparency in a release process. So, in this case, XZ Utils had GitHub Actions for building the binaries and running tests, which is really important to prove that everything works. But then when you upload a release to GitHub, there was no transparency into that itself. One of the open source projects I'm a maintainer of is under the CNCF, is called Ntoto. And it's this specification for creating, verification of different steps that happen throughout your build and development release process. And it helps build an actual chain of trust. And you can start from your source code and make sure that the output of your git clone operation at the beginning is what actually gets input to the build process. So in this case, if somebody adds a random file in, you would be able to know, like, this doesn't match up with what's on GitHub. And doing this throughout the whole process, having that whole chain, it's not going to stop everything, but it's going to give you way more transparency. You'll be able to identify the compromise, the threats much more reliable and faster. But that's more work. It's more effort for a maintainer to do that. And so the OpenSSF as a foundation is doing a lot of great work in trying to help and support these organizations. But some of them still have a hard time of seeing the value because of the way companies approach them. I don't think it's that they inherently want to develop insecure products or anything else, but you mentioned scanning tools, right? When a bunch of enterprises come to you and say, I have this scan result and it says your project has these 8 CVEs, you need to fix them. There's, I think a well-earned ability to say, I don't really want to take your feedback on this because you're not being helpful. You're making my job harder.
Well, you kind of bring up a thought. If they can't, let's say, and I don't want to, I'm paraphrasing, I don't want to like quote you verbatim, because you certainly do understand everything in this world a lot more than I do. I'm just a fan, right? I would say an enthusiast. So when something like this happens, I can't imagine other people not going, ooh, never thought of that before. Is it going, I'm not going to ask, is it going to happen again? Because it probably will. Do you believe it could increase in frequency now that it's been shown, or at least the timeline with what happened with XZ Utils? How more frequent is this going to be happening?
So yesterday.
Oh, okay, well, that was fast.
There was a blog post from OpenSSF in the coordination with the OpenJS Foundation that there were a set of emails going out to maintainers, pressuring them, trying the exact same type of social engineering. And so now there's an email that was sent to the CNCF TOC trying to spread awareness about these social engineering attacks and help people understand the threat and be a little more wary of, especially it's the same as any phishing attempt, right? You get a text message on your phone that, hey, it's John, it's the CEO. I need you to go buy me gift cards right now. Like, you don't need to do it right now. Why do you need to do this? And as people are, it's harder with security though, because there can be a real urgency to fix vulnerabilities. And so that pressure is there and it's harder to defend against it in some way.
Yeah, you're only as strong as your weakest link. And it seems this is a motif, right? Social engineering, where it's the person. It's not necessarily the code itself. It's a person that is able to figure their way out to be able to do something nefarious that is a bit more, I guess, frightening than a mistake in the code. A mistake, that's going to happen. It's a given. But when there is code that the world relies upon, that to me is just, I trust you, right? I trust you more than I trust a computer or I trust code because you're a human being. But when a human being is the one that is basically making that exploit happen, that's where it's, I don't know how your part of the world really feels about that.
Yeah, it's, you want to always have an assumption of goodwill, like you said. And I think hopefully people don't lose that. Like, I'm an idealist. I want to believe that we will address this problem in a good way and be able to respond to it and allow people to continue contributing. There are some areas where there are these knee-jerk reactions to say, we need proof of a real identity of this person before they can commit code. We need to know what country they live in. And those things are really worthless for a lot of different reasons, but also they're exclusive. We should allow anyone to contribute code from anywhere in the world. There are people who need to protect their identity because of the harassment that happens to them in technology if they're an underrepresented individual. And so I will always push back against that idea. And really, it's just we need to have better development processes. We need to understand the threat more. As an industry, as people creating solutions for this, we need to make them easier to use, more common, integrate them into the tools developers want to use so they don't have to think about the security problem, but we can address it.
John, I appreciate your time and your expertise. I've learned a little bit. I will never become a master, but I appreciate the work that you do for the rest of the world.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
If you like this video, please give us a thumbs up. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, you can always subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're on all the major social media platforms. You can always find us at thenewstack.io. We hope to see you soon.